Hi again. History of Christianity, Kenneth Scott Latourette. In the chapter The Smaller Eastern Churches, he's concluding his discussion of the Nestorian Christianity and its eastward extension. This is particularly about the growth of the church in India and China. Nestorian Christianity was planted in India. Our knowledge of how and when that was done is tantalizingly fragmentary. We know that there were Christians in India before the rise of the distinctive Nestorian beliefs, and that these may have come through commercial contacts with the Christians of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt. As we have said, tradition even ascribes the first Christian preaching to the Apostle Thomas. In the 13th and 14th centuries, travelers from Western Europe found well-established Christian communities on the coasts of South India and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The more detailed reports of Western Europeans of the 16th century makes it clear that the ecclesiastical language of these communities was Syriac, indicating that they had been nourished and perhaps planted by Syriac-using peoples, and their church connection was with the Nestorians of Mesopotamia. Inscriptions concerning Christians found in South India, dating from the 7th into the 9th century, are in Pahlavi, or Middle Persian. All of this seems to point to the growth and perhaps the introduction of Christianity in India through contacts from the 6th century onward with the Christians, primarily Nestorians, of Persia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. From what we know of the history of trade, it is natural to assume that the contacts were made largely through commerce, for the Christian communities were on or near the coast and in or near cities, and from as far back as pre-Christian times there had been maritime trade between India and the lands to the west. The Nestorian communities in India, however, seem not to have been primarily the descendants of immigrants, but to have been of Indian stocks. This would appear to point either to extensive intermarriage of Christian immigrants with indigenous peoples, or to active missions as their source, probably in association with the Christian mercantile communities. It was through Nestorians that Christianity was introduced to China. The year of the first known coming of Christianity to that vast land was 635. At that time, the Tang dynasty had recently risen to power, and Tai Tsung, the ablest monarch of that line, was on the throne. China was entering on one of its glorious epochs in its history, and for 2 centuries or more was the most powerful and perhaps the wealthiest realm on the planet, rivaled only by the Arab Empire. And that did not long remain as united as did China. The first missionary, Alo Pen, came to the capital Chang'an, the present Xianfu. Chang'an, probably the largest city in the world of that day, attracted representatives of many races and faiths. Tai Tsung is said to have given Alo Pen a cordial welcome, and after he had examined translations of the books which the latter brought with him, to have ordered the preaching of their contents. He may have done this because he was fairly tolerant of all religions. In succeeding years, Christian monasteries were founded in several centers. Christian literature in Chinese was produced, and a metropolitanate was created for China. Some converts were won, but the core of the Christian communities, and perhaps their membership, was predominantly foreign. Buddhism, then in its heyday in China, Taoism, and a reviving Confucianism were the prevailing religious systems of the empire. Christians were a very small minority, perhaps not as numerous as Muslims, Manichaeans, or Zoroastrians. Late in the 9th century, there were still Christians in China, but an imperial edict of 845, which was directed primarily against the Buddhists, and which also included Christians in its proscription, seems to have brought a sharp reduction in the number of the latter. The disorders which accompanied the end of the Tang dynasty, late in the 9th and early in the 10th century, may have contributed to a further decline. Monks sent in 980 to put the church in order could find no traces of Christians in the land. And here's his summary comment in this chapter on the smaller Eastern churches. We must note that in the vast area covered by this brief chapter, and especially in Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, we appear to see one of the striking failures of Christianity. Here was a major reverse, indeed the major territorial reverse of all the history of the faith. Here Christ had lived, died, and risen again. Here the gospel was first preached. Here the original Christian churches came into being. And here the name Christian was coined. Here were 3 of the 5 great patriarchal sees of the Catholic Church: Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, and the earliest creative theological thinking. It was here that monasticism arose, and with its daring and resolute dream of the complete attainment of the Christian ideal. Yet, here, Christians were more divided than anywhere else in the first 1,000 years of the faith, and fell further short of the ideal of the unity of love than elsewhere. In some areas, the majority adopted the Christian name, but much of this was superficial and could not stand the test of adversity. When Islam came, born by conquering Arabs, the churches shrank and slowly became fossilized and sterile. To be sure, some converts were made to the east of the Arab domains, notably by the Nestorians, but they were usually small minorities. Yet more than any other religion in Islam-dominated lands, Christianity displayed the ability to survive and to reach out into new areas and propagate itself. Now, Latourette wrote all of this in the 1950s. Could he have foreseen what would happen? Latourette, by the way, was a specialist on India and China, especially China, though, and wrote a book on Christianity in China. Could he have foreseen what we now see, namely that in China itself are somewhere between 70 and 100 million Christians at this time? The next chapter is the Course in Western Europe, chapter 13. I'll put in a link to a parallel with Israel, really, in that Israel's faith too faltered seriously after existing for about 1,000 years. The belief in Yahweh in the Old Testament faltered seriously, and there's a parallel in Israel in that voices were raised to meet the situation head on. The prophets of the 9th through the 5th century were speaking against this tendency for Israel's religion to be merged with the religions of its neighbors. So I'll put in that a parallel based on the first chapter of Isaiah. This one is actually from Amos. Amos, the day of the Lord. This teaching of the day of the Lord rose in the days of Isaiah, but Amos is the one who made the phrase famous, although it occurs in the other prophets too. So the day of the Lord in Amos, as described for us by one of the great commentators on Amos, J.A. Mocher, Alec Mocher. See you next time.